Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and good morning everyone. Another lecture by me today is regarding the ventricular system of the brain, ventricle of the brain. Okay, this all the specific objectives of this lecture. Number one is to identify all the 4 ventricles of the brain. Secondly is to describe the important relations and describe the formation, circulation, and drainage of the cerebral spinal fluid. So this is going to be a very quick lecture. Brain contains 4 cavities known as ventricle. They are lateral ventricle, two lateral ventricle, the left ventricle, lateral ventricles, the third ventricle, and the fourth ventricle. So in the middle, 2 lateral ventricles and 1 third and fourth ventricles. Okay, this is how it looks under the CT scan or MRI. So this is the ventricle that contains the CSF. It contains the CSF, cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, the ventricular system is continuous with the central canal of the spinal cord from the fourth ventricle and subarachnoid space around the brain, allowing for the flow of the CSF to circulate around the brain and spinal cord. The function of the ventricles, they are filled with CSF, cerebral spinal fluid, which bath and cushion the brain and spinal cord. They are protecting the spinal cord from any impact of movement. Okay, this is how the ventricular system connected with central canal is to the fourth ventricle. This is the fourth ventricle. Central canal is the central canal of the spinal cord. It is also connected to the arachnoid, to the venous system, through the arachnoid crenulation. And also subarachnoid space. Okay. These 4 ventricles communicate with each other and with the subarachnoid space. The lateral ventricles communicate with third ventricle. Lateral communicates with third ventricle through the interventricular foramen, or also known as foramen of Monro. And the third ventricle communicate with the fourth ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct or aqueduct of Sylvius. And from the fourth ventricle, it communicates to the central canal of the spinal cord through the median aperture into the subarachnoid space, to the median aperture and the lateral aperture. Here. Median and lateral apertures. Median aperture is also known as median foramen of McGinley, and lateral apertures also known as foramen of Flushka. Okay, this is the lateral ventricle, very big one. We have 2 lateral ventricles on each of the cerebral hemisphere, right and left lateral ventricles. It connected to the third ventricle through the foramen of Monro, and the third ventricle connected to the fourth ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct or foramen of McGinley. So foramen of Sylvius, okay, aqueduct of Sylvius. And this is the median aperture for the fourth ventricle to the subarachnoid space through the foramen of McGinley and the foramen of Flushka, the lateral aperture. Okay, this is how it looks. the ventricular system. The lateral ventricle, the central ventricle, and the fourth ventricle. Lateral ventricle connected to the third ventricle through the foramen of Monro. From the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle is through the central aqueduct of Sylvius, and from the fourth ventricle to the central canal and to the subarachnoid space through median aperture and lateral aperture. The lateral ventricle. So this is the lateral ventricle. It's an arch-like configuration. They can be divided into 5 segments: anterior horn, the body, or the central part of the lateral ventricle, and the collateral trigone, the atrium, the posterior horn, and inferior or temporal horn. So it is the anterior, the body, or the central part of the lateral ventricle, and then the trigone, atrium, and then the posterior horn and inferior or temporal horn. Okay, anterior horn, the body, the atrium or trigone, posterior horns, and inferior horn. Let's go to the third ventricle. The cavity of the third ventricle is located between 2 thalamus. Two thalamus and hypothalamus. It communicates with lateral ventricle through the interventricular foramen or foramen of Monro, and communicate with fourth ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius. The fourth ventricle is located between the anterior surface of the cerebellum and posterior surface of pons and medulla. It communicates with subarachnoid space through the foramina, 3 foramina, 2 lateral and 1 median. 2 lateral is foramen of Luschka, and 1 median is foramen of McKinley. And inferiorly, it's connected to the central canal of the spinal cord. Right. Again, picture showing something. Okay, this is for some quiz for you. What is A? A is the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle, B body, C trigone of atrium, D posterior, inferior, and temporal horn of the lateral ventricle. E is the third ventricle, and G is the fourth ventricle. Cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. Okay, what is CSF? It is clear, colorless fluid found in ventricles and subarachnoid space of the brain and spinal cord. Average volume in adult is about 140 ml. Mass of the fluid, which is 80 milliliter in the cranial, and 30 ml in ventricle, and 30 ml in the spinal subarachnoid space. CSF composition differs slightly from plasma. It has lower protein and glucose level and contain very few cells. CSF is formed by correct plexus. So this is the correct plexus, and reabsorbed by the arachnoid villi and granulation, and returned back to plasma through the venous system. The function of CSF is, number 1, is to support the weight of the brain within the skull. So because our brain weight is about 1.4 kilo in the air, but when it is suspended in the CSF, it is reduced to plus minus 45 gram. So it's actually support the weight of the brain being the skull. It also acts as mechanical protection, shock absorbing fluid, and chemical protection. It provides a constant chemical environment for CNS. pH of the CSF important in the controlling in the control of breathing, circulation for the exchange of nutrients and waste products between the blood and nervous tissue. The main source of CSF is from the choroid plexus. The choroid plexus. Other minor source of CSF production is ependymal cells lining the ventricles. And also extraventricular cells are cerebral. Peduncle. Location of the choroid plexus. With the body, the atrium, and inferior horns of the lateral ventricle. The roof of the third ventricle, and posterior part of the roof of the fourth ventricle. And also interventricular foramen. CSF produced by the choroid plexus passes through the ventricular system. Passes through all the ventricular system, lateral ventricle, third ventricle, fourth ventricle, and exit fourth ventricle to the foramen of Luschka and Legenday and enter the subarachnoid space. Enter the subarachnoid space. And after passing through subarachnoid space, CSF reach the arachnoid villi. So in this picture, the arachnoid villi to be reabsorbed into the venous system. Okay, the choroid plexus produce the CSF and circulate through the lateral ventricle, third ventricle, fourth ventricle, and to the subarachnoid space, and eventually return to the blood through the arachnoid granulation or arachnoid villi. There are two major factors influence the circulation of CSF through ventricles and subarachnoid space. Number one is subtle pressure gradient. Differences between the site of production and site of reabsorption. A very subtle pressure. One side produce, one side reabsorption. So it influences the movement of the CSF. Number two is mechanical factors, position of arteries in subarachnoid space and gentle movement of brain during normal activities. Most CSF is reabsorbed through arachnoid villi. Right. Minor site for CSF reabsorption is ependymal ventricle, the cell that lining the ventricle, arachnoid membrane, perineural sheath of the nerve. This is the arachnoid granulation. And some clinical anatomy regarding the ventricle. So how to sample CSF? It is through the procedure called the lumbar puncture. So the lumbar puncture. The needle is usually inserted at L3, between L3 and L4 level. Why? Because the spinal end at L1 and 2. So to prevent any injury or trauma to the spinal cord, the needle must be inserted a little lower the caudal end of spinal cord. Usually, the doctor will puncture at the level of L2 or 4. What is the location of the L2 or 4? It is actually by drawing an imaginary line through the PSIS, posterior superior iliac spine. So it is where the doctor will puncture. It's between the L3 and L4. Okay. The needle will be inserted up until the subarachnoid space of the spinal cord. And when the doctor is in, the doctor will remove this needle and allow the CSF to flow in out through this throat. Excessive amount, and another one is the hydrocephalus. It is defined as excessive amount of CSF within the cranium and dilated ventricle. Usually happen in a baby. Okay. This is the appearance. The baby appearance will be big head. Okay, there are some features of hydrocephalus, and this is how it looks under the radiograph image. This is normal, and this is dilated ventricle and hydrocephalus. Okay, this is the arrow indicates how is the CSF produced, where is the CSF produced, and how it circulates within the ventricle, subarachnoid space, and where is the location of its return into the plasma. Okay, picture showing the ventricles. I think that's all. I wish you all the best. The way to get started is to quit talking and begin tuning. Thank you, everyone, for your attention. Thank you.